Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to another video about Fallout Van Buren. Last time we looked at Design Document 3, getting a general overview of the Boulder Dome location, as well as the NPC factions that it had to offer. This time, I thought we'd continue our analysis of the design document by taking a closer look at the main quests that the player would have ended up having to deal with if they wanted to keep the dome running. Boulder Dome is a location in the middle of multiple crises, on the verge of complete and utter destruction from a half-dozen prominent threats. Fortunately, the player would be able to resolve most of those situations with a combination of diplomacy, puzzle solving, and brutal combat. First, let's take a quick look at the general layout that was planned for the Boulder Dome location. It was intended to be an area broken up into 10 main maps, with 5 of those maps making up the dome itself, 2 maps representing different points of entry into the dome, and 3 maps being dedicated to the various external threats trying to overwhelm the dome's defenses. The facility itself was a huge geodesic dome constructed from cement or concrete, and mostly submerged in the ground. It was broken up into 5 main levels, with the first 3 levels being dedicated towards research facilities and living quarters, the 4th level being made up of various steam and utility tunnels, and the 5th level housing the Zax mainframe that runs the facility. The 2 separate entrance maps were the secret tunnel entrance and the train station. The player was most likely to arrive at the train station by following the tracks leading into Boulder Dome, and this is where trading would be done if the player ever established trade routes leading to and from the location. The secret tunnel entrance, on the other hand, was more likely to be discovered from the inside, by exploring the tunnels on the 4th level of the Boulder Dome and stumbling across the exit that would lead out into the wilderness. This could serve as an invaluable shortcut for players trying to reach Zax. This is also where the player would first encounter Xian, one of the Boulder Dome scientists who was also planned as a potential player companion. More on that in the next video. The East Garage also marked a potential point of entry, but didn't get its own submap. This entrance would only be accessible from the world map if the player had already secured a way to open the dome's garage door, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other 3 maps are left rather vague in the design document, but each served as a potential battleground where the player could confront the respective threats that they contained. The Jackal camp was where the player could confront the Jackals, a gang of bloodthirsty cannibalistic raiders. And the Baggers camp was where the player could confront Sergeant Larsen and his increasingly irrational men. The Dead Ghoul graveyard would initially serve as a passive threat, posed by an assortment of dead but still very radioactive ghouls, which the player would need to find a way to safely dispose of. But new glowing ghouls would also occasionally spawn here, serving as both a renewable threat as well as a renewable source of loot and experience points. Now, as I mentioned last time, Boulder Dome is somewhat unique in that the player would be confronted with a different scenario depending on when they first visited the location. If the player arrived during Act 1, while they were still being actively hunted by the ODYSSEUS AI from the Tibbetts prison facility, then they would walk right into the middle of a civil war being fought between Victor Presper and Goddard, the 2 senior scientists in the facility. In this case, they would arrive to find immediate signs of recent violence, because Presper and his men, led by General Coleridge, had to fight their way in past the blockade set up by the Jackals. Presper's train, the General, would be located out near the train station, along with several pools of blood and piles of bones. Opportunistic players could try to mess with Presper's train, likely the first fully functional train the player would have come across this early in the game. But Presper, always 3 steps ahead, would have anticipated this. His train was rigged with explosives and a radio detonator, so the most the player could hope to achieve was to inconvenience Presper by forcing him to blow up his own train. Getting access to the dome, at least the first time around, involved having to go through the quarantine center, accessible from the train platform, or going through the East Garage entrance. The player would either have to hack the computer at the entrance on the train platform, or get past multiple groups of Jackals to reach the garage entrance. Things get a little vague here, but it's implied that Helen, Eddie Galensky's girlfriend, might have approached the player before they reached the dome, in hopes of getting them to help resolve the brewing crisis. It's also implied that Presper himself might have ordered the player to come inside to help with repairs. It's possible that the exact plot hook might have varied depending on what type of character the player was running, with tech-minded characters being ordered to help with repairs, and more combat-oriented characters instead being recruited by Helen. Either way, the player would have to resolve a hostage crisis in the East Garage area, where some of Presper's men, led by a soldier named Pierce, were holding Eddie Galensky and Helen's many kids hostage, as leverage against the rest of the scientists. Presper himself would be secure in the robotics lab and would present his orders to the player remotely, making it impossible to kill him. The player could either cooperate with Presper, eventually prompting the mad scientist to leave once he had got everything he wanted, or they could go in guns blazing, rescuing Eddie and the kids by killing Pierce and the other rogue NCR soldiers, in which case Presper would end up leaving anyway, with all the supplies that he and his remaining men could carry. Either way, the net result would be more or less the same, with Presper escaping, the dome's supplies being severely depleted, and the player getting access to Goddard and the other Boulder Dome scientists. It was essentially an event intended to introduce the player to the main antagonist of the game, and to get them inside Boulder Dome so that they could continue pushing the main plot forward. One slight oddity in the document involves Presper reprogramming the facility's robobrains to attack Goddard and the player 48 hours after he left. The reasoning behind this decision is particularly vague, with some explanation stopping in mid-sentence. It's possible that this part of the event was going to be cut, because it would directly conflict with some of the other plot elements related to Zax and the robobrains, and would have only served to further disrupt Presper's grand plan, by endangering the Sleepers, the cryogenically frozen scientists that he hoped would repopulate the Earth once he had killed everyone else on the planet. Once the initial threat with Presper had been dealt with, Goddard, although annoyed by the player's presence, would be remarkably accommodating, because he would welcome an alliance with anyone who opposed Presper. This would give the player the opportunity to explore the dome and take on a number of quests involving the various problems the scientists were facing. The most obvious threat would still be posed by the Jackals, the cannibalistic raiders that were persistently trying to find a way into the dome so they could feast on everyone inside. They would have war parties and scouts positioned around the dome, some of whom the player may have already killed while getting into the dome. They would also have a roadblock set up between Boulder Dome and Denver, thoroughly disrupting what little trade the scientists had managed to establish. The simplest way to deal with the Jackals, but by no means the easiest, would be to kill them. Much like the wild dogs in Denver, there would be a finite number of Jackals in the area around Boulder Dome, 100 in total. If the player wiped out all of these Jackals, including their leaders at the Jackal War Camp and the Jackals manning the roadblock near Denver, then the quest would be completed and Goddard would reward the player. The player could also try to negotiate with the Jackals, but this would be perilous in the extreme. The Jackals were near feral, valuing strength and virility over all else, and if the player did anything to even imply weakness, then they would quickly find themselves under attack. But if the player tread carefully, then they would be able to meet with the three leaders of the gang: Banshee, their leader, Howler, their lieutenant, and Crazy Bitch, an exiled daughter of Hecate who just happens to be the one that convinced the Jackals to turn to cannibalism in the first place. While the player wouldn't actually be able to convince the Jackals to leave by talking to those three, they would theoretically be able to gather enough information to point them towards Ouroboros, another location that served as the base of operations for the Daughters of Hecate and their mad tribal goddess. They're a subject for another video, but suffice to say, if the player could forge an alliance with them, then they could ask the Daughters to order the Jackals to leave Boulder Dome alone. After the Jackals, the second most prominent threat would be posed by Sergeant Larsen and his men, all former NCR soldiers who were desperate to get inside Boulder Dome. The soldiers were sick, suffering from the combined effects of rat-away withdrawal, starvation, and radiation poisoning, but their desperation still made them dangerous. They're the ones who helped to organize the Jackals' more recent raids on the Dome, sabotaging external equipment and cutting off the Dome's trading route with Denver. They would have a very tenuous truce with the Jackals, but they wouldn't really trust them. In fact, given that paranoia is a side effect of rat-away addiction, they wouldn't really trust anyone, making most attempts at negotiation pointless. Unless the player was willing to help them get back into the Dome, or at least get them adequate supplies, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with the player. Although the player could kill them, there were also some other more clever ways that the player could end up dealing with Larsen and his men. If the player were to steal Larsen's Geiger counter, for example, Larsen's paranoia would cause him to snap, and he would start killing his own men, convinced that they were the ones who had stolen it. The player could also promise to bring Larsen more RAD-away, but dose it with sedatives ahead of time. If the player did this, and the Jackals were still around, then the raiders would quickly take advantage of the situation, killing and eating the soldiers. That would just leave the glowing ghouls. Initially, this would be presented as more of a puzzle than a combat scenario. Larsen and his men already killed the first few batches of ghouls that wandered towards Boulder Dome from the ruins of NORAD. The problem is that their corpses are still highly radioactive, which would still pose a significant danger, so the scientists would ask the player to dispose of them properly. Although the document doesn't go into much detail here, the player could apparently do this by either using cement to bury the corpses, or they could take the easier route and cart the corpses back towards the NORAD crater. Either way, the player would end up being confronted by more glowing ghouls while completing the mission, prompting a combat scenario. Notably, since these ghouls were former staff or soldiers from the NORAD facility, they would be carrying some potentially interesting pre-war loot. But the player would have to find a way to decontaminate it if they wanted to use it safely. Once Act 2 began, the Dome would find itself facing another major crisis, as their ZAX mainframe began to run out of hard drive space. Once Act 1 was completed, and the player became aware of the situation, their quest log would be updated with a counter showing how close ZAX was to running out of memory. If this memory ever got too low, then he would start overwriting the scientist's research data, disrupting certain quests and preventing the player from using the Dome's facilities. If ZAX ever completely ran out of memory space, then he would cannibalize his own operating system, effectively killing himself and permanently shutting down the entire Dome. If this happened, then the facility would be rendered useless, the sleepers in cryogenic storage would die, and the Boulder Dome scientists would be doomed. The doors would all be unsealed automatically to prevent anyone from being trapped inside, but this would also allow any remaining external threats, such as the Jackals or Larsen and his men, to get inside and immediately begin attacking the scientists. The player would be able to delay the counter by retrieving various forms of storage media, such as holodisks and holotapes. There were also a number of other small tasks that the player could perform around the Dome to free up some of ZAX's hard drive space. They could also discover that Presper was trying to find a solution to this problem as well, and that he had brought a large storage device called a data can with him, but that the one he had brought had been incompatible with ZAX. Ultimately, the player would be presented with two options. The optimal solution would be to find an appropriate data can to hook up to the AI, giving it ample room to continue operating for the foreseeable future. This would involve having to find the crashed remains of Bomb 2 in the Grand Canyon, a location the player would have to visit eventually anyway, towards the end of the main storyline. A second possible solution was to use the Think Tank, a container of living brains stored on one of the lower levels of the Boulder Dome. These brains were still living and capable of communication, but the player could overwrite them using code technology, essentially turning them into wetware, living hard drives for ZAX to store his excess data on. This would save the Dome, but would essentially be tantamount to murder, and at least some of the Dome's other residents would be very disappointed with the player's decision. That covers the most prominent crises that threaten to wipe out the inhabitants of Boulder Dome. And it just goes to show that the player would end up having to do a lot of work if they wanted to keep the facility running. But all that work would theoretically pay off, because the dome was filled to overflowing, with all manner of potential rewards in the form of unique tech and research possibilities, as well as various utility functions that the player wouldn't be able to access anywhere else. We'll get into all that next time, with the final part of our analysis of the Boulder Dome document, where we'll look at all the other little sub-quests and secrets that the player would have theoretically gotten access to when they were between managing all those other disasters. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages of the design documents for yourself at the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.